From burning down his own credibility to accidentally starting a civil war to somehow becoming a national hero after getting shot in broad daylight. This is every single U.S. president ranked from an absolute disaster to an actual legend. 45 men have held this job, and let's just say the grading curve is not kind to most of them. And yes, some of these rankings are going to make you mad, and honestly, that's half the fun. But first, let's start at the very bottom, because somebody's got to be worst, and this guy earned it fair and square. Coming in dead last is Franklin Pierce, a man so forgettable his own political party refused to nominate him for a second term, the only elected president in American history to get that kind of treatment from his own side. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically told Kansas to sort out slavery with rifles instead of votes, and the result was a 5-year bloodbath nicknamed Bleeding Kansas. Houses burned, families were slaughtered, and Pierce just kind of let it happen. Historians literally call him the fireman who set fires. Not exactly a compliment, sir. Right above him, James Buchanan, the guy who watched the entire country secede state by state and just shrugged the whole time like it wasn't his problem. He said secession was illegal, then said there was nothing he could legally do to stop it. Sir, pick a lane. By the time he left office, 7 states were gone, federal forts had been seized, and the nation was in absolute free fall, all wrapped up with a bow and handed straight to Abraham Lincoln to deal with. He essentially spent his final months in office watching the house burn and insisting he'd left the stove off. Then there's Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination and immediately started undoing everything the Civil War was even fought for in the first place. He vetoed civil rights protections for formerly enslaved people, pardoned thousands of former Confederates, and got himself impeached, surviving conviction by exactly one single Senate vote. History was this close to being rid of him for good, and honestly, that's a little too close for comfort. Warren G. Harding is next, a man who privately admitted, in his own words, that he had no business holding the office he was elected to. His administration was so corrupt it basically invented the modern political scandal, complete with bribed federal oil leases and outright stolen veteran funds meant for wounded soldiers. He died mid-scandal, and honestly, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief when it was over. His own attorney general reportedly took kickbacks to let Prohibition-era criminals run wild, which is a wild sentence to even say out loud. William Henry Harrison technically doesn't even get a fair grade, since he served just 31 days and never signed a single piece of legislation in office. But we're ranking leadership here, and delivering a 2-hour inauguration speech in freezing rain without a coat, at 68 years old, isn't exactly a masterclass in decision-making, sir. Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act, turning ordinary citizens in free states into legally required slave catchers overnight, on pain of imprisonment. It was supposed to preserve the peace between North and South. Instead, it radicalized huge swaths of the country and basically lit the fuse for everything that followed over the next decade. Even people who never cared much about slavery suddenly found themselves furious that helping a stranger could land them in a federal prison cell. Herbert Hoover watched the stock market collapse and responded to Depression-era veterans peacefully protesting in Washington by sending the actual U.S. Army, tanks and tear gas included, against his own citizens. Banks failed, unemployment hit 25%, and Hoover's name became a punchline for poverty itself, with entire shanty towns getting sarcastically named after him across the country. He entered office as a self-made millionaire humanitarian and left as the guy who ordered tanks against his own veterans. Then we've got Benjamin Harrison, who jacked up tariffs to nearly 50%, blew through the entire federal surplus like a kid with his first paycheck, and then casually pieced out back to Indiana right before the economy collapsed under his successor. Classic move, dodge the blame, keep the pension, write some books nobody reads. Andrew Jackson had personality for days, sure, survived duels, beat up his own would-be assassin with a cane, but forcibly relocating tens of thousands of Native Americans along the Trail of Tears, resulting in thousands of deaths, is about as dark a stain as a legacy can possibly get, no matter how tough the guy was. He also became the only president in history formally censured by the Senate, though his allies later scratched it out of the record with thick black lines, as if history could just be crossed out. Woodrow Wilson led the country through World War I, sure, but he also criminalized criticizing the government, letting over 2,000 ordinary Americans get prosecuted just for speaking their minds out loud in public. Free speech, meet wartime paranoia. He also resegregated large parts of the federal workforce, which historians still can't really spin into something positive. He then pushed hard for the League of Nations, only to watch his own Senate reject it, leaving him standing outside a club of his own creation. Richard Nixon is obviously showing up here, the only president in history to ever resign in disgrace rather than face removal. Watergate wasn't just a break-in, it was a full-blown cover-up recorded on his own White House tapes, in his own voice. At least he was self-aware enough to walk before Congress could drag him out kicking and screaming. His own party told him privately he'd lose an impeachment vote, so he took the exit before the door slammed shut on him. George W. Bush inherited a booming economy and a budget surplus, and handed off two grinding wars, a global financial crisis, and a permanent surveillance state that's still fully operational today. Hurricane Katrina alone should be a lifelong asterisk stapled next to his name, with the Louisiana Superdome turning from shelter of last resort into a full-blown humanitarian crisis on live television. Moving up slightly, we've got John Tyler, a man so disliked by his own country that he later joined the Confederate Congress against the United States. He remains the only U.S. president never officially mourned by the federal government after his death. Rough way to be remembered by history forever, honestly. James Madison gets docked hard for one specific afternoon in 1814, the day British troops literally burned the White House to the ground, and he had to flee the Capitol on horseback. Father of the Constitution, apparently not exactly father of home defense, sir. Zachary Taylor barely gets graded at all because he died just 16 months into office from bad cherries and contaminated milk on the 4th of July, but the political instability he left behind didn't do the growing sectional crisis any favors either. James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Martin Van Buren round out a stretch of solidly forgettable middle-tier presidencies. Competent enough not to blow anything up, forgettable enough that most Americans couldn't pick a single one of them out of a police lineup today. Van Buren especially gets remembered for basically nothing except a brutal 5-year depression on his watch and an unfortunate nickname on his way out the door. James Polk actually gets more credit than most people realize. He set 4 specific goals for his presidency, achieved every single one of them, including massively expanding U.S. territory through the Mexican-American War, and then simply walked away after one term like he had somewhere better to be, sticking to his word completely. He worked himself half to death in the process and died just months after leaving office, which is either dedication or a warning label. Chester Arthur is a genuine underdog story here. Nobody expected much from a guy who got the job through assassination, but he surprised absolutely everyone by cracking down on the exact political corruption machine that had put him in office in the first place, reforming the civil service system almost overnight. Rutherford B. Hayes deployed federal troops against striking railroad workers during the deadliest labor unrest of the era, which is a serious black mark on his record, but he also pulled federal troops out of the South, formally ending Reconstruction, for better and for worse, depending who you ask about it. Grover Cleveland gets credit for being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in American history, stubborn honesty included, even if his handling of the Pullman strike, sending 12,000 troops into Chicago, wasn't exactly worker-friendly at all. William Taft is remembered mostly for getting stuck in a White House bathtub, but he also expanded the Supreme Court's authority and, fun fact, eventually became Chief Justice of that very same court after his presidency ended. Only guy in American history to ever pull that off. Calvin Coolidge kept his mouth shut, kept the government small, and kept the economy humming right up until the crash that technically wasn't his fault, though critics still argue his hands-off approach to Wall Street helped set the table for it anyway. William McKinley expanded America into a genuine global power after the Spanish-American War, right before becoming the 3rd sitting president assassinated in office by an anarchist. His death, tragically, is exactly what finally got the Secret Service full-time presidential protection duty. Lyndon B. Johnson pushed through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, 2 of the single most consequential laws in American history, while simultaneously escalating the Vietnam War into a full-blown national nightmare that cost him the rest of his political career. Complicated legacy doesn't even begin to cover it. Jimmy Carter gets underrated as a president and overrated as a former president, brokering the historic Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, but ultimately sunk by inflation, gas lines, and the Iran hostage crisis he simply couldn't resolve in time before the election. Now we're climbing into actually decent territory. Dwight Eisenhower kept the Cold War cold for 8 straight years, built the entire interstate highway system practically single-handedly, and warned us about the military-industrial complex on his way out the door. Genuinely ahead of his time, sir. Bill Clinton presided over a booming economy and an actual budget surplus, first one in decades, though the Lewinsky scandal and his resulting impeachment left a permanent stain right next to all those good numbers. Ronald Reagan helped bring the Cold War to a peaceful close and revived a battered economy through tax cuts, though the growing wealth gap and the Iran-Contra scandal keep him from a spot any higher up on this list. Barack Obama pulled the country out of the Great Recession and passed the Affordable Care Act, expanding healthcare access to millions of Americans who'd never had reliable coverage before in their lives at all. Ulysses Grant gets more credit today than history originally gave him. Sure, his administration was riddled with corruption scandals he didn't personally orchestrate, but he also crushed the Confederacy on the battlefield and fought hard for civil rights protections during Reconstruction, deploying troops against the Ku Klux Klan. He later lost his entire life savings to a Ponzi scheme in retirement, then wrote his memoirs while dying of throat cancer just to keep his family out of poverty. Harry Truman had to make the single heaviest decision of the entire 20th century, dropping the atomic bomb to end World War II, and then spent the rest of his presidency rebuilding a shattered world through the Marshall Plan, all while somehow finding time to desegregate the entire United States military by executive order. John F. Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis with more restraint than most world leaders would have ever managed, staring down actual nuclear annihilation for 13 straight days and somehow talking everyone off the ledge in real time. He also launched the space race in earnest, promising the moon, literally, before the decade was even out. Now we're getting into legend territory, sir. Theodore Roosevelt broke up dangerous monopolies, protected millions of acres of American wilderness for future generations, and once finished an 84-minute campaign speech with an actual bullet lodged in his chest. Tough doesn't even begin to cover it, and he still managed to survive an African expedition and an Amazon River voyage after leaving office, just for fun. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence and then doubled the entire size of the country overnight with the Louisiana Purchase, arguably the single greatest real estate deal in human history, all for less than 3 cents an acre. He also somehow died on the exact same day as his old friend and rival John Adams, 50 years to the day after they both signed the Declaration of Independence, which is either poetry or the spookiest coincidence in American history. Franklin D. Roosevelt got elected 4 separate times, pulled the country out of the Great Depression, and led the Allies through World War II, all while secretly paralyzed from the waist down and slowly dying by the end of it. Absolute grit from start to finish. He steered the country through the Great Depression and the deadliest war in human history back to back, without ever letting the public see just how sick he actually was. George Washington set the entire template for what a president even is, and then voluntarily walked away from power after 2 terms when he could have easily stayed in office forever like a king. That single decision alone saved American democracy before it even had a real chance to fail. He also survived his own military disasters along the way, at one point exploding in rage after an entire army was wiped out fighting a Native American coalition on the frontier, and he still course-corrected without losing the room. And at the very top, Abraham Lincoln, who held a shattered country together through the deadliest war in American history, ended slavery, and did it all while getting hated by half the nation the entire time he was in office. He paid for it with his life and still gets remembered as the greatest president this country has ever produced. He spent barely 5 weeks in office before Fort Sumter was fired on, and he never once wavered on holding the Union together, even as the death toll climbed past 600,000. Now, we've still got a few recent presidents whose full legacies are honestly too early to properly grade. Guys like George H.W. Bush, who steered the country through the peaceful end of the Cold War and a swift Gulf War victory, but got voted out after just 1 term anyway, and our most recent occupants of the office, who history simply hasn't finished judging yet. Ask me again in about 50 years, sir, because the ink on some of these legacies is still wet, and it's honestly more fun to watch it dry in real time than pretend we already know how the story ends. So there you have it, every single president ranked from an absolute disaster to an all-time legend. And if you think this list is controversial, just wait until you hear about the presidents who almost got themselves impeached and somehow survived anyway, because a few of those stories are even crazier than anything you just heard.